On Friday last week, American and Iranian negotiators held face-to-face talks for the first time since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. After something like 21 hours of continuous negotiations, the two sides apparently gave up, with J.D. Vance, who led the US delegation, citing the familiar stumbling block of Iran's nuclear program, and saying that the US had made its final and best offer. Hours later, US President Donald Trump announced via Truth Social that, in reaction, the US would be imposing a naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. So, in this video, we're going to explain why the US, which has spent the past few weeks asking for the strait to be reopened, is now blocking it, and whether this new strategy will work. Explore which world leaders are winning and which are losing every week with our podcast, The World Leader Leaderboard. Find it over on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. So let's start by explaining what Trump's new plan actually involves. Broadly speaking, there seem to be three parts to it. First, and most obviously, a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. In his original Truth Social post announcing the blockade, Trump seemed to imply that the blockade would apply to all ships going in or out of the strait. But US Central Command has since clarified that the blockade will in fact only apply to ships entering or departing Iranian ports, and not just Iranian ports inside the Persian Gulf, but also ones on the other side of the strait, like Bandar Ijask and Chabahar. In this sense, the blockade is probably better construed as a blockade of Iran rather than of the Strait of Hormuz. Anyway, the second part of the plan is that, at least according to Trump's Truth Social post, the US Navy is going to seat and interdict any ships that pay a toll to Iran to pass through the strait, including apparently ships that have already paid the toll. This bit of Trump's plan has received less attention in the press, but if Trump actually follows through, it would be incredibly provocative. This would mean the US Navy chasing down tankers, most of which are now days into their journeys out of the strait, and stopping them from delivering oil to importing countries, many of which are already facing fuel shortages. It's also worth saying that at least 2 Chinese ships and 1 Russian ship have transited the strait in the past week, presumably with Iranian authorization. And it's hard to imagine either Beijing or Moscow accepting America's right to interdict their ships as part of a blockade that they're not party to, and which has no basis in international law. Finally, the third bit of the plan involves clearing the Strait of Hormuz of mines. For context, while there hasn't been a full-throated mining operation yet, last month there were reports that Iran had dropped a handful of mines in the strait, which has been enough to deter most commercial traffic. Trump has since claimed in an interview with Fox News that other countries like the UK will also be involved in the mine clearing operation, but no other countries have confirmed this, and the UK specifically has denied these reports. So that's what the plan actually involves, but what's the strategic objective? Well, the overarching strategy seems to be to essentially put economic pressure on the Iranian state by cutting off its access to oil revenues and toll revenues. If this works, it could plausibly constrain Iran's ability to finance its war effort, and give the US more leverage in future negotiations. At first glance, this strategy looks relatively sensible. After all, it's true that, unlike every other Gulf country, Iran has been able to continue exporting oil out of the strait at basically the rate it was before the war. This has been great news for Iran's finances, especially because global energy prices have surged, and because, after the US withdrew sanctions on Iranian oil last month in an attempt to bring down prices, Iran no longer has to sell its oil at a discount. At the same time, Iran has apparently been taking in something like $2 million per ship via its new de facto toll booth between Keshem and Larak Islands. Although we should say that, in part because only a handful of ships are transiting the strait at the moment, these toll revenues pale in comparison to the oil revenues. So, you get the idea. This new blockade is apparently intended to cut off Iranian revenues, presumably in order to force further concessions. So, will it work? Well, we think it's unlikely, for the simple reason that it's hard to see why we should expect a blockade to force further concessions when weeks of airstrikes, to say nothing of the decades of prior sanctions, didn't. Conversely, an embargo will mean zero oil, gas, or anything else coming out of the Strait of Hormuz, which will mean even higher global oil prices and even more dysfunction in the global economy. This will put more pressure on Trump, who's clearly very sensitive to both gas prices in the US and moves in the stock market, especially if Iran interprets this as aggression and thus decides to retaliate, either by restarting strikes on oil and gas facilities in nearby countries or by closing the Bab al-Mandab, another strait connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden. This is something that Iranian officials threatened to do last month, and could be achieved either by Iran launching strikes at commercial ships passing through, or by involving the Houthis, who control most of western Yemen and are widely considered, if not an Iranian proxy, then at least aligned with Iran. This would all mean higher energy prices and yet more dysfunction for the global economy, especially because the Bab al-Mandab, which usually sees something like 10% of the world's oil and gas pass through, has become even more important to global energy markets in recent weeks, as countries like Saudi Arabia have started redirecting exports that would have gone via the Strait of Hormuz out via Bab al-Mandab instead. Moreover, the optics don't look great for the US here, given well, they're now the ones blocking the strait, which means it'll be easier for Iran to blame them for the subsequent disruption to the global economy. In his Truth Social post, Trump tried to frame the embargo as a defence of safe and free maritime passage, insisting that Iran's new toll system was illegal and that either the strait should be open for all or closed for all. To be fair, most other countries agree with this argument, and you could maybe imagine a world in which, if it was framed in these terms and organised in advance, the blockade could have been an international effort, led by the US, but supported by other countries similarly opposed to the idea of a toll. The problem for Trump here, however, is that he's apparently organised this on a whim, and he can't plausibly make that argument, given he literally suggested a couple of days ago that the US could toll the strait instead.